Welcome to Elf Needleworks. I'm Evelyn, or Elf. Are you like me? Do you have a bit of a yarn problem? After a few years or a few big purchases, this yarn builds up and soon you're finding yourself with yarn crammed in every available space in your tiny apartment. I have been crocheting for about 18 years, and that means that I have about 18 years of buying experience, or perhaps some might call it hoarding yarn. If you're starting to get a bit overwhelmed by your yarn, it might be time to go through it. Personally, I've never really got rid of any of my yarn, but I think it's about time for me to do a deep clean and go through every single thing. And I thought I would take you along with this journey, and maybe you'll find some useful information in here for your yarn hoard. Being faced by such a daunting pile of yarn can be a little overwhelming, so I like to break my yarn down into smaller, more manageable categories. The first sorted category that I'm going to start with is ongoing projects. I'm going to be pretty harsh with this category. This category is reserved for yarns that I don't want to mistakenly get rid of or use by mistake on some other project. The only yarn that will 100% be going in this category is yarn that I currently have dedicated to ongoing projects that I have started. Something like this is a good example of what would go into this category. This scarf is made using 3 different colors of yarn, some of which are not connected to the actual project itself. This yarn is 100% dedicated to this project, and I am currently reasonably certain that I will be finishing it. Not only is this scarf and its yarn getting set aside and essentially labeled as off the table for future projects, but it's going to be put in its own individual bag. In these dedicated project situations, all these yarns, hooks, needles, partially made items will be going into something that I call temporary storage. You'll see that my projects are going into plastic bags. Some of mine are going into paper bags or cardboard boxes. The key is that it is temporary. You will finish the project. You will. Sorting your projects this way is going to accomplish 4 things. 1, it prevents all of your active yarn from getting tangled in with the rest of your yarn. Even if you keep all of your ongoing projects jumbled together in the same permanent container, the temporary containers will keep them separate enough that your tangle isn't going to get quite as bad as it could. 2, keeping your active projects separate but in the same location means you will always know where to look if you just need a quick project to pick up and work on. You won't be doing what I tend to do and just picking up project after project after project. Number 3, you will finish your projects. They're in a temporary container. This means that your projects will be completed so you can get rid of the temporary container. You will finish your projects. Say it with me. You will finish your projects. They will not hibernate forever. It's temporary. You will finish your project. Number 4, it makes it super easy to take a project on a go. They're already pre-packaged in their own little containers, so you can just grab one, pop it in your bag, and you are ready to go. Every time you go to pick up a project, no matter how old it is, you know that you have all the tools needed to complete it, pre-packaged in a bag, ready to go. The only thing that I personally don't put in these bags is my patterns, because I keep them digitally. If you're the kind of person who has physical patterns, it might be helpful to put a note as to what pattern it is, or even fold up the pattern and put the physical pattern itself in the bag. Since you're going through your projects, this is also your opportunity to repurpose some fails. It's completely normal to not be quite ready to take part in progress projects, but if you're like me, you probably have a few in-progress projects that have been in progress for years with absolutely no progress being made. Ones you're not ready to pull apart yet can go in their own temporary container, and ones you are ready to pull apart get taken apart and the yarn can get repurposed and recategorized. If knitting or crocheting is your hobby, please remember that these failed projects have already given you everything that they can. You learned a new skill, or tried a new yarn, or discovered that there's a method that you actually hate. Or maybe you just found out that you didn't have as much yarn as you thought you did. Either way, that's something that you learned through doing that project. And once you've pulled apart that project, that yarn can be used for something new and can bring you even more crafting joy. And maybe some more lessons. Either way, once you've pulled apart your project, that yarn is free again and is far more useful to you than that half-finished project. I'm going to take this opportunity to show you how to deal with some of those messier yarn balls. You basically just loosely loop it around your hand about 10 times, fold it in half, and then wrap it around 10 more times around the middle, and then slowly just sort of keep rotating it and wrapping it. At the beginning of wrapping it, you're probably only going to be able to get maybe 4 to 5 wraps at a time, and once the ball gets bigger, you'll be able to go up to 10 to 12, but I wouldn't go any bigger than that as it can start slipping off. Another thing to keep in mind when you are winding balls of yarn is that you don't want to make them too tight. If the tension on the balls of yarn is too tight, it can cause your yarn to deform. It puts stress on the yarn and it will be stressed pretty much constantly while it's stored. So make sure that your tension is pretty loose. You want the balls of yarn to be pretty squishy by the end and not firm. If they're firm, it's probably stretching that yarn and warping it over time, and it's worth going over and redoing it. Now that we've separated our projects from our yarn, we should just be looking at a bunch of yarn now. I have all of my yarn out of containers and out in the open so I can get a better feel of what kind of categories are going to work best for me. This makes it easier for me to sort the yarn, but also exposes the bane of my existence: the tangle. The tangle is created by the same demon that knots your headphone cords in your pockets. You may choose to sit and carefully untangle your tangle and try and preserve as much yarn as possible and reduce yarn waste, but this tangle's a bit big and a bit old, so I'm just gonna be cutting it out. I have a jar that I keep yarn scraps in that are too small to use for any projects, and I'll be putting this tangle there. If you're an amigurumi or stuffy maker, these scraps are great for putting into small features like toes or in anything you want to be particularly stiff and not very squishy. You could also use it at the bottom of the plushie to make it a bit more weighted. It's not as heavy as those plastic beads you find or beans, but it's a great low-cost alternative that can be washed. Now that I've extracted that beast, let's move on to the sorting. If you're the type of person that gets rid of yarn, this is your time to do it. All of your yarn is laid out, so take a good hard look at it and see what yarn you know you won't use. Are there any fibers you hate? Colors that you find ugly? Yarn you simply don't like working with? Put those aside now. Put them in a paper bag. You can give this yarn to a friend who crafts, you could donate it to a thrift store, and some churches have volunteer crafting groups. If you are going to donate to a thrift store, make sure that they do take yarn donations first. It seems to be very dependent on the individual store, from my experience. We are now finally left with just the yarn that will be going into your personal stash. There are many ways to sort your yarn from here, and it will depend a bit on the kind of things that you make. You can sort by fiber content, yarn thickness or weight, how much yarn is left, the color of yarn, or the texture. What you're trying to accomplish when you are sorting your yarn is setting up a system that makes your future crafting easier. For me, the 3 main things that I make are stuffies, blankets, and hats. That's about 2/3 of my projects that are subjected to regular washing, so my first priority is fiber content. I'm going to start by sorting my yarn into 2 categories: acrylic and not acrylic. Acrylic yarn can go in the washing machine on gentle and even the dryer on low, and pretty much every other fiber I have cannot handle that kind of washing. I worked almost exclusively with acrylic yarn for years, which is evidenced by just how much acrylic I have. Even though not acrylic encompasses a huge variety of yarns, it's not something that I have a lot of, so I can put all of that into just one container. And I don't really feel like I need to sort alpaca yarn from whatever this is. Therefore, all of my non-acrylic yarns are going into a permanent container, and the acrylic is going to stay out for further sorting. The next thing I'm going to do is take all of my variegated yarn, so any of my acrylic yarn that has patterns on it, and just put it in its own container. double knit, worsted weight, it's all going in here. Generally, I find that projects that I'm making out of scraps work better if they're made out of all variegated yarns or all plain yarns, and that's why I'm dividing my yarn up this way. Now, the variegated yarns are in storage. I then like to sort my yarn by how much yarn I have left. I like to think about it in terms of how much of a particular yarn it would take me to complete a project. By this, I generally mean that I try and think of what the biggest thing I can make using one individual color of yarn could be. Usually when I divide up my yarn, I divide it into scraps, enough for a hat, and then enough for a blanket. However, because I'm going to be doing a crazy amount of stash busting and just trying to get rid of considerable amounts of acrylic yarn, I'm going to be dividing it into two piles, which is enough for a sweater and not enough for a sweater. Most of my acrylic yarn is either double knit or worsted weight, so I try and keep in mind that two balls of yarn that are the same size will have different lengths of yarn if they are different yarn weights. This is a general guide for double knit and worsted weight yarn and about how much yardage it will take to do the three categories I mentioned: sweater, hat, scrap. Personally, I just kind of eyeball how much of each yarn is left and make an educated guess as to where it goes sorting wise. If you have a decent approximation of how much yardage you have left of a yarn, you can use this chart to help you decide how you want to sort your double knit or worsted weight yarn. All yarn comes with a label that details the yardage. Some, like Big Twist, have yardage estimations on the label for certain types of projects. This time, it's just all the stuff that's for a sweater that will be sorted into storage. So I'm going to take all of my yarn that is in the sweater or bigger category and put it all together in one bucket. Everything that is in the hat and scrap size range is going to be sorted a little bit differently from here on out because I already have future projects in mind. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take all of my plain acrylic yarns and divide it into two categories, and I'm just going to be dividing it by weight. I'm going to put all of the worsted weight in one container and all of the double knit in another. And that leads us to the last element here of organizing and destashing your yarn, which is using up the yarn you have. Go shopping in your own yarn stash before going out and buying more yarn. This is a lesson that all of us have trouble learning from time to time, but it's an important one. For me, for example, if I find a sweater pattern I like, I know that I need to go into the box that has the amount of yarn appropriate for a sweater in it. If I find something using worsted weight yarn that makes something about hat sized or smaller, I know I can go into the worsted weight yarn box. If I find a pattern for socks that I want to make, I know that I need to check my not acrylic box first. I've actually divided my yarn up in the way that I have in order to do some scrap busting projects. That is, I will be finding projects that will be perfect for using up a tremendous number of scraps all at once. Probably the hardest part of anyone's yarn stash to use up is the scraps. Anything smaller than a hat, I've found, is pretty difficult to get rid of. As I said before, scraps can be used as stuffing, but what if you're not a plushie maker? They can be used as accent colors in color work. If you have a very large amount of scraps, it might be time for a scrappy sweater, a scrappy rug, or even a scrappy blanket. I actually have this blanket here that I've started to make using all of my double knit acrylic scraps. Personally, just sorting through the scraps gives me a sense of accomplishment and helps me clear out some old stuff and deal with things preventing me from working on new stuff. I hope this encourages you to go through your yarn stash and maybe deal a little bit with that mess you've been ignoring. Thank you for watching. If you liked this video, please consider subscribing or maybe just judging my yarn taste in the comments. What yarns do you dislike working with? Is this how you would organize your yarn stash? Would you be interested in seeing a video about specifically projects that use up your scraps? Let me know in the comments and maybe I'll come out with a new video soon. Mwah. Mm-hmm.